In this video, we're going to talk about COVID-19 vaccines, the science behind it, and some of the main front runners in the vaccine, I guess we could call it a race almost, to develop an effective vaccine. That being said, I'm going to stick to things that I don't think are going to change too much in the next short little time period. And then at the very end of the slides, I will add in anything that might be the most up-to-date since I filmed this, which is on 11/11, or anything that I think might change a little bit because it's so new. We aren't going to go in depth into any of the topics in my other vaccine video, so please make sure that you do watch that. However, I wanted to remind you that the main idea with all vaccines is to get an immune response to some aspect of the virus in order to teach the immune system to recognize it in the future. Something you'll hear discussed a lot is target effectiveness. I think it's worth noting what the effectiveness for other vaccines are so that you can see how vaccine effectiveness, or not, and disease prevalence go hand in hand. Two of the most contagious diseases that we have are whooping cough, otherwise known as pertussis, and measles. These have incredibly high R0s, but they also have pretty good vaccines with reasonably large adherence to the guidelines on getting the vaccines. The measles vaccines, however, is far, far better, with a 2-dose effectiveness of 97%. My age is approximately where they started giving 2 doses, so those that are older than about 34-ish should get titers run to see if they are immune. This vaccine results in generally less than 500 cases of measles, and normally well below that within a year. Even in the really, really bad 2019 season, most of the cases were centered in one particular New York anti-vax bubble. So though the numbers are really high, it's less high when you think about kind of the more general population. Whooping cough is nearly as transmissible as the measles, but it does not have that good of a vaccine, especially since the early 2000s when it was replaced with a safer but less effective vaccine. Though it is quite effective initially, its protections wane heavily over time. This is a vaccine that adults need to go in and get boosters for every 8 to 10 years, depending on who you ask and which papers you read. Yet hardly anyone does, unless they're pregnant or going to be around young babies and the parents ask them to. There's also significant evidence of significantly reduced immunity at 8 years, but many doctors believe in only doing it every 10. And with that decrease in efficacy, you see the number of cases is far, far higher. Tens of thousands get pertussis each year in the US. And this is likely underreported, as getting diagnosed with a low-level whooping cough is nearly impossible, as nearly no one actually carries the tests for it. There's also some evidence of asymptomatic or nearly asymptomatic carriers in those who have had the vaccine but then get exposed later on to the virus and they pick up this kind of low-level infection. And that's actually a concern that's going to come up in COVID too, that perhaps the vaccine could keep you from getting sick, but maybe not keep you from picking up the virus and spreading it to others. So then let's move down to the flu. The flu actually has a relatively low R0 in comparison to these other ones. You'll find a pretty wide range depending on your source. I tried to include the widest range reported between about 1 and 3. Even with this R0 well below that of the previous examples, we of course have millions of cases of the flu each year. This is due to another huge drop in vaccine effectiveness and a huge drop in people who actually get the vaccine. Only between about 33 and 56% of adults get the flu shot each year, and there's very little immunity that is retained for the seasonal flu from year to year. Even among young adults that believe the flu shot is effective, safe, and that everyone should get them, there's actually low vaccine compliance. People forget or they get busy, and after all, it's, quote, just the flu. Except the flu kills people too. So please get your flu shot to save somebody's grandma or grandpa's life. Now, let's think a bit about what this means in general for ending a pandemic. Thankfully, COVID-19 has an R0 more like that of the flu than the other diseases, if we kind of assume and averaged up the published results in our estimate. What is needed for herd immunity depends quite a bit on the individual viruses, specifically, and it's R naught. The higher the R naught, the more people we need to be immune in order to reach herd immunity. The measurements of R naught for COVID-19 do vary quite a bit, and the R naught for the flu do as well. Generally, COVID-19 seems to be measured as a bit higher as compared to the flu. Please keep in mind that my constant comparisons to the flu are not meant to equate these two. They are obviously extremely different, but rather so that we have a general sense of how these numbers play out, since we do have a general sense of how the flu plays out. Keep in mind, if we treat this identically to the flu, we will likely have significantly higher numbers of illnesses, severe life-altering symptoms, and death. Most analyses that I've seen say that we'll need about an 80% or more effective vaccine in order to reach herd immunity, and that is to assume that 100% of people will get the vaccine. These are results that are done based on modeling. The most common phrase used about models is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so we want to keep that in mind. It could be off in either direction, but it does give us a starting place to consider. I would like to note here that R naught is based on virus spread without taking any precautions. When people talk about the need to lower R naught, they actually are using this slightly incorrectly. What they mean is that we need to lower the RT or the RE, which is the R naught modified by the human behavior and is the actual spread. We have two main things that we're looking for in a vaccine. We need it to be safe, and we need an immune response. Safety is always important and is more complicated to define than people on either side of the vaccine, the pro-vax, anti-vax discussion make it out to be. But it becomes especially complicated when you have a really deadly and prevalent disease. We have extremely high standards for safety in this country because our disease prevalence is so low when we're talking about all of our general vaccines. Really, anything other than a very mild fever is going to disqualify a vaccine in any normal situation, such as measles, pertussis, etc. In our current situation, we're going to have to decide as a community what level we're willing to accept depending on how the safety studies come out. Thankfully, so far, it appears that the current vaccines are extremely safe, and this hopefully won't be an issue. mRNA and DNA vaccines also have the added benefit of not using any live virus, or even a whole inactivated virus. It's basically just a recipe for certain proteins. This has been used to hypothesize that they'll actually be safer than if we tried for other kinds of vaccines, and maybe one of the reasons why the companies decided to start with that. That being said, of course, I want to reiterate that we have very, very safe live and inactivated viral vaccines as well. So just because it's live or inactivated doesn't make it unsafe. Again, extremely, extremely high safety standards for vaccines in the US. And with the COVID-19 vaccines, if it winds up that those live and inactive viral vaccines that are also in trials wind up being more effective, we're going to want to consider using those. So let's talk a little bit about how safety is decided. The clinical trials for this do look a little bit different than most normal clinical trials. So when we've talked about this before, we've talked about it in terms of more normal drugs, where you do a phase 1, which is a small safety study, a phase 2, which is a larger safety study, and then a phase 3, which is an efficacy trial. In a case like vaccines, your safety and your efficacy almost go hand in hand because you can't do any sort of challenge trial. You have to just wait for people to get sick and then see if it's effective or not. And so oftentimes for vaccines, instead of having 3 phases, they'll have 2 phases. And these are called phase 1/2, which is small scale safety studies. And then phase 2/3, which are larger scale efficacy trials, but are also looking for safety. Especially because most vaccines, if they do have any side effects, are so extremely rare that you have to have really, really large scale trials to be able to even see any of them. And then you'll often hear the phrase DSMB board, which is sort of like pin number in the sense that the B is for board. But the DSMB is an oversight committee. And they're made up of people, kind of just a wide variety of people, including like people in academia and things of that sort. They're actually able to go in and see unblinded results. So these are not the researchers, because if the researchers could do this at any point in time, you might have problems with all of the things that we've talked about in experimental design and why we want to keep things blinded. However, when you're doing clinical trials, you do want somebody to be able to go in and look at the unblinded results and make sure that everything's okay and make sure that people are not being harmed by this. And so if at any point in time something seems like maybe it's unsafe, the DSMB can go in and they can look at the results and they can say, okay, do we need to end this trial? So they're actually able to end trials early if it's deemed too unsafe. And technically, they can also end early in order to say, we want to support giving this and approve this if the efficacy data is extremely, extremely strong. So they're given a lot of power here if they want to use it. So we also then, of course, are going to need long-term follow-up observational studies. And for COVID-19, this is likely going to be done concurrently with just the rollout, because we need this vaccine and we need to keep people safe. And we don't necessarily have time to see what's going to happen to 5 million individuals for 3 years or 4 years. So we'll roll it out before those. And that's pretty standard. That being said, the trials themselves are huge, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And that lends to a huge amount of safety credibility for these, because if this was even remotely common to have bad side effects, they'd show up in these large 60,000 people trials. You'll note from earlier discussions that this process is generally incredibly long and arduous, often taking as long as 15 years to get a working medicine or vaccine. This has been expedited in order to hopefully have a working vaccine in 1 to 2 years. This is being done by cutting through a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of red tape that is required to do these. It's also been done by allowing a faster progression into phase 2 and 3 trials. So they weren't required to finish phase 1 trials before moving on to phase 2 and 3. Most of the protocol narratives also have very specific endpoints listed, which would trigger ending the study on the basis of proving vaccine efficacy. If you have an effective vaccine for a deadly and prevalent disease, there is significant ethical issues to be considered that are not necessarily considered if we're just trying to make a better vaccine for something else or a medicine for something. So we're going to come back to some of that shortly. There are a lot of vaccine trials going on right now. At the time that I made this, there are 51 listed. To look at a table with all of these, you can check out the link in the slides. However, there are 4 in the US that are getting a lot of attention. I've listed these out in this table. You'll notice that 2 of these are mRNA and the other 2 are viral vector vaccines. You'll also remember these are both brand new tech section of our last video. There are some trials listed in the first page using more traditional methods. I'm honestly not quite sure why the big US pharmaceutical companies skipped over the more traditional options. I have several completely unfounded musings about it, but without any deeper insight than that, I'm not comfortable talking about that here, as the experts haven't really weighed in on that I've been able to find. Now, all of these are going to have a 2-year follow-up on them, meaning that they'll be monitoring everyone in the study for 2 years after the last dose. Keep that statistic in mind, because we'll come back to a question on that later. For a quick view of all of the vaccine candidates as of September, you can look at this chart published in the paper that is linked here. This hopefully is comforting, that even if all of the big commonly discussed trials in the news fail, we have many, many others in clinical development and even more coming up through preclinical development stage. This may also mean that a first vaccine with a low efficacy, such as 50%, is discovered and starts to be distributed, but then another one with a higher efficacy comes along, which raises many scientific and ethical questions. The companies have all done something super interesting for these trials, and that is to release the protocol narrative in full online. Protocol narratives are the document that they submit to the regulatory bodies to ensure that they have a safe and effective clinical trial. It has every tiny single detail about every tiny single decision for the trial in it, and is required to be updated if anything in the trial changes. While absolutely under no circumstance am I requiring you to read through these, if you're interested in what one of these documents look like, here are the links for you. Here you can see detailed information about how sample sizes are calculated, how the blinding is done, what safety protocols are put in place, and what monitoring protocols are put into place, and so much more. Right down to the fact that they actually give sex education to help avoid unwanted pregnancies during the time that the shots are given, as they don't want to test this in pregnant women. For some very specific definitions of fun, these are kind of fun to look at. A quick reminder on how both of these vaccines work. In many ways, they are very much like the subunit vaccines. The idea is to expose the cell to only particular parts of the virus that are needed to elicit an immune response. However, instead of using the proteins themselves, they use either mRNA or DNA. This DNA or mRNA then uses the cell's own machinery and the central dogma that we talked about last week to create proteins. These proteins then elicit the immune response. That's the overarching idea. There are lots of tweaks that can be implemented. For example, if its vector can replicate or not. If it is an mRNA, they can also include some viral replication machinery so that a little bit more mRNA will be made within the cells than what is given. And each of these tweaks have pluses and minuses. Often the trade-off is between a greater immune response, which is good, but that might result in greater side effects. Or if we want to lower the side effects, that might cost a bit of an immune response, which could decrease efficacy. So we saw this in our discussion of the Tdap vaccine, for instance. Then, of course, differences in dosages and adjuvants can be done just like any other vaccine or medicine. So there are lots of questions that come up around COVID-19 vaccines. We have to consider safety. This so far is looking great. I know lots of people are continually discussing the concern of it being rushed through and being unsafe, but I haven't seen anything from actual scientists pointing to this being a particular concern just due to who is actually in charge of getting the vaccine out. It seems like our oversight committees will be able to prevent any sort of political pressure here. But besides that, the safety profiles are looking great anyways. We really don't have any idea of effectiveness. To know that, you have to do the studies. And it's an interesting issue because as we use social distancing, mask wearing, and other things to prevent the spread, we are also making it harder to tell if the vaccine is effective. There's been talk in England of doing challenge trials where after you give the vaccine, you then purposely expose the person to COVID-19, which obviously comes with a huge host of ethical issues. And most scientists and doctors do not agree that this is a great idea. And then comes another big question mark that we won't know the answer to for quite some time. And that is, how long does the immunity last if it is effective? Is it like the measles vaccine that most people only have to get 2 doses of and never again? Or is it like the flu where it needs to be given every year? We do have some preliminary evidence on safety. However, as it's very preliminary and mostly done in news release form, that will be talked about on the slides and in class as opposed to in the video in case it changes. I don't want to cement it in case it turns out to not be quite as good as what was released. Once the vaccine is made, and if proven effective and safe, we then will have to consider the distribution process. Making billions of vaccines is not going to be instantaneous. If patents are going to be enforced, we have to talk about that. We have to talk about how to distribute. We have to talk about who gets it first, and many other variables to be considered. Another issue that comes up is what happens if people in a vaccine trial that was not particularly effective gets another COVID-19 vaccine that does have a higher effectiveness. Will this cause any problems or interaction? No one really seems to know. Though on its face, it seems like it probably shouldn't. Immunology is a very odd beast, and there have been examples of clinical trials of vaccines in the past, which have actually caused the infected person to get a worse case of the disease if exposed. We've never had a situation where there were so many vaccines in a clinical trials for one disease all at the same time, though, so we have nothing really to base our answer to this? No one really knows the answer, even if we're just talking from a purely scientific standpoint of, can you get the vaccine? Can you get a new vaccine if you've already had an older one? For class today, I'm going to have you guys discuss the following questions in your groups. Start with whichever ones you found most interesting and work your way to the least interesting, as we may not have time to get to them all done. I'm including them all in the video so you have some time to think on them before getting into your groups. And I'm going to talk just kind of a little bit of an introduction to each one. And hopefully you have some time to think on this before coming to class and talking about it with each other. These first few really straddle a line between scientific questions and ethical ones. In some ways, we could look at these questions from a purely rational numbers approach and say that given some modeling, what numbers do we need to break even? So let's read them out. At what efficacy level would be valuable to end the study? And what harm could this cause? So in other words, if we wanted to end the study early and try to get the vaccine out faster, what level of surety do we need to be able to do that? In your opinion, I'm not asking from a legal perspective or from the protocol narrative perspective or what the scientists and politicians have decided. I'm just asking your opinions on what you think. And then what harm could that possibly cause? Then if the vaccines were shown to have significant side effects, should they still be approved? What level of symptom frequency and severity would be acceptable? And then if you were to approve them, what problems could that cause? And if you say, I wouldn't approve them, what problems could that cause? So kind of on either side of the answer, what problems could it cause? And then lastly for this slide, should challenge trials be allowed? So a challenge trial is where a person is exposed to the disease after receiving a vaccine, which none of the current trials are. So I then ask why or why not. And then follow-up questions. If you think that they should be allowed, or even if you just say, yeah, it depends, what needs to be considered to help ensure appropriate ethics are followed? And if you're saying, no, there is no such thing as appropriate ethics in a challenge trial, what is the cost to not doing a challenge trial? And then why is that cost acceptable? Before you come to class, if you haven't ever heard of the trolley problem, please Google it quickly. There's bazillions of great resources on it. It's a classic philosophy 101 type thing that they talk about. But I feel it very much comes into play with a lot of these concepts. Because while at first we can say, well, we would never truly know if our models are close to correct, even if we hand wave our philosophical wand to say, yes, let's say that our models are completely correct, I think that a lot of people would still find some of these questions really challenging. So I'm going to save the rest of the discussion for this in class. The next question I'd like you to consider is, how should the vaccines be rolled out if they are approved? This is probably going to be a pretty big issue no matter which vaccines are approved. That being said, it's a simpler question if the vaccine is you get one or two and you're done for forever. It gets pretty complex if we're talking about something that might need to be given every 3 months for full efficacy. So something like the flu shot has to be given once a year. There are some virologists and immunologists that are cautioning that it could be possible that we might have to get a vaccine for COVID every 3 months. And now our rollout procedures become quite a bit more complicated because you have to do this continually, which means you need continual doses of the vaccine. So think about this for all the various frequencies that might be required from an approved vaccine. So I'd like you to think about, given that we are unlikely to be able to get enough vaccine once it's approved for every single person right away, how should they be distributed? Who should get them first? So I want to remind you that the vaccines are trialed on people between 18 and 59-ish, plus or minus a couple of years, depending on the trial, and that no pregnant or breastfeeding people have been allowed to get the vaccine as part of the trial. And then I also want to remind you that the risk of COVID-19 complications and death scales tremendously with age, especially if you're over the age of 60. It scales tremendously with BMI, and that is an independent risk factor. So in other words, BMI, even if you have healthy blood pressure and cholesterol and a lot of the risk factors that come with high BMI, that still puts people at higher risk, and they aren't entirely sure why, though there are some hypotheses. Pregnancy seems to put people at a higher risk, about 50%, though as a general rule, pregnant people tend to be young, and they tend to have low risk factors in the other cases because it's actually harder to get pregnant otherwise. And so even though pregnancy does scale their risk quite a bit, it's within a low risk age group. And then really any kind of heart problems. So people who have high blood pressure, cholesterol, clotting factors, anything involving heart issues have a higher risk for COVID-19. And then of course, diabetes and any sort of lung issue as well. These next two fall into a little bit more of a pure ethical, value, social, political sphere. But I think it's still worthwhile to talk about it today and give up some of our science time, quote unquote, to this. The first is related to an early scientific question, but it is quite a bit different. I feel like it needs a bit of an intro so that everyone is on the same page of why this first one even is a question. So the question is, if a person is enrolled in a trial with a 50% chance of having a placebo and then a vaccine is approved with a known efficacy, what happens? So in other words, if you're in a medical trial A and you have a 50-50 shot of having gotten a vaccine, and medical trial B shows a reasonably high efficacy, let's say 70%, should you leave your current trial to get the vaccine of trial B if it's approved? The answer of can you is yes, absolutely. Ethically, we cannot ever force someone to stay in a medical trial against their will. However, those trials have a certain number of people enrolled in order to reach a statistical endpoint where they're able to tell if a vaccine is or isn't effective. If half of their participants leave, they will not have statistical power anymore, and we will not know if that vaccine is effective. So what do you think people in these trials should do? What would you do? Which is often a very different question, right? What we can say is correct for people to do and what us personally would do may not be the same. What should the companies doing the trials do in terms of this in general? That question you can kind of take a lot of different ways. And then why does any of this matter if we already have an approved vaccine? As a bit of a spoiler, it does matter if we already have an approved vaccine. So I'm asking you why. Now, next up in our questions. If we get a vaccine, should it be required? We effectively force parents to vaccinate their children via requirements for daycares and schools. This is done with the logic of if you're going to participate in the community, then we need you to do your part in protecting the community as well. While we used to allow personal exemptions, the state of California has come down extremely hard on this, making medical ones required and then making it very difficult for pediatricians to write exemptions. Do you think that we should institute something similar for COVID-19 vaccines if it comes out? If so, how do you think that we should enforce it? We obviously can't enforce it in quite the same way we do with kids because adults don't go to school or daycare. If you don't think that it should be required, how do you address the loss of life issue that is bound to continue if we do not achieve herd immunity? If you aren't sure or think that perhaps it depends, what does it depend on? And why does it depend on that? And as appropriate, the same questions that I asked to the yes or no answers. Those are the last of the questions I have for you. We will spend all class period talking about these questions. So keep that in mind and we will see you in class. And if you go to the end of the slides here, I will add any extra slides or comments or issues that come up in the next week. And we can talk about that in class a little bit before we move on to the questions so that we're all up to date as the individual minutes and moments come through.